Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Moody Center for the Arts. I can't tell you how happy I am to see you all in person. I'm Allison Weaver. I'm the executive director here, and we are delighted to welcome you to the School of Architecture's lecture series, which is a really important occasion and one worthy of celebration, because this week we are celebrating the 5th anniversary of this building, the Moody Center for the Arts, designed by Michael Maltzan, who's here with us to talk about it. So it's exciting and important, and we're so happy to share it with you both in person and online. I thought I'd start today with a little bit of a personal backstory about how the building came about and how Michael and I got to know each other. When I moved to Houston in 2015 to help launch the Moody, all I knew was that from my temporary office across the street, there was a giant empty lot and just a pool of dirt. And I thought, oh boy, we have a long way to go. I better go meet the architect that Rice and its infinite wisdom, with the help of Suzanne DeBooth and the Buildings and Grounds and Committee, had engaged Michael Maltzan. So I flew out to LA and went to his studio in Silver Lake. And you could imagine my delight when I entered the studio and he and his team had built an extraordinary model with the initial designs of this building and how it could bring art and ideas to Rice University and to Houston through a brand new structure. So my first thought was excitement. And my second thought was how extraordinary that this visionary architect is matched in both his design sensibility, but also his kindness and generosity and charming personality. And I remember leaving that first meeting thinking, this is gonna be okay. This is gonna work out. We're gonna be fine, we're gonna build a great building, and we're gonna bring new ideas to Rice University and to Houston. And as we work together over the next 2 years to bring this space to life, two things really impressed me about Michael. The first is his ability to balance his extraordinary architectural vision and what's required to make a building architecturally important and distinctive with the functionality and the need not just to enable the function of a building, but to actually elevate that function through the design. And for me, that was a really like a master class in balancing those two things. And it was an extraordinary process, and I think we all benefit from the results today. The second thing that impressed me about Michael was his incredible patience and fortitude and resilience in dealing with building a building at a university. And those of you who've worked in a university context know that there are multiple rounds of approvals and processes and budget meetings that can be challenging at times. And Michael brought an extraordinary amount of patience and persistence and sensitivity to those meetings that I think resulted in the end in a building that worked for all of its constituents, and we're so lucky to have. So just a note on about how it's going to go tonight. I will give a formal introduction to Michael because he has a long list of accolades, and for those of you who don't know his work, I'd love to share them with you. And then we'll turn it over to him to give us a presentation on his work, and you'll see some fantastic images behind you. And then my colleague and partner in tonight's presentation, the William Ward Watkin Dean of Architecture, Igor Marjanovic, will be joining me, and we'll ask a couple of questions before turning it over to you in the audience to have a dialogue with Michael about his practice. So now for the official introduction. Michael founded Maltzan Architecture in 1995, and as many of you know, his projects cross a wide range of topologies from cultural institutions to city infrastructure, and his notable projects include, of course, the Moody Center for the Arts, and MoMA Queens, the Star Apartments, the Pittman Dowell Residence north of LA, the 6th Street Viaduct, MIT's Vassar Residential Hall, and the Winnipeg Art Gallery's Inuit Center for the Arts. Michael received a master's in architecture from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard and a BFA and Bachelor of Architecture from RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design. He's a fellow of the AIA and received the 2016 AIA Los Angeles Gold Medal. He's also a recipient of the American Academy of Arts and Letters Architecture Award and was elected to the National Academy of Design in 2020. He currently serves on the Dean's Leadership Council and the Visiting Committee at Harvard's GSD, and his work was named one of the 25 best inventions of 2015 by Time magazine. So as many of you know, his work has gained international acclaim for innovation in both design and construction, and has been recognized with 5, I could list a lot of medals, but I'm gonna skip forward here because I think you know that he's won multiple citations and awards both nationally and internationally. But I think one thing that I'd like to highlight just for our purposes here at the Moody is that he's worked on quite a few exhibitions in museum contexts around the world, including work at the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA, MoMA in New York, the Heinz Architectural Center, and the Canadian Center for Architecture, and the Carnegie Museum of Art. And I think you'll see his sensitivity to art and creativity in both the spaces here at the Moody and in other work he's done. As a firm, his work was selected for several architectural biennales in 2006, 2018, and 2020. So with that, I'd like to give a warm round of applause for Michael Maltzan.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you for having me. It's unbelievable. It's been 5 years. I'm sure everybody feels the same way. And it's also quite something to be in this space and talking with you. That's exciting in and of itself. You don't get that opportunity all that often. This is the first live talk I've done since the pandemic, which is pretty exciting. So I promise it's going to be under 3.5 hours. Thank you again to Allison, Rice University, Suzanne, terrific to see you. Suzanne Deal-Booth, who was very involved in making the Moody Center happen, and we've been involved in other architectural and arts-related exploits in the past. I'm really going to talk about our work in relationship to the arts and arts practice. Specifically because of this talk being related to the anniversary of the Moody Center and what the Moody Center is doing here. I have a strong belief, and have since the very beginning of my work at a personal level, especially starting my architectural career by going to a school of architecture in an art school at RISD, that art and architecture share something extremely important, and that is a deep belief in each of the respective disciplines having a responsibility to push those disciplines forward in relationship to their history, to the present, but also to speculate about the future that we are all moving towards. And those two practices, while often very different, share an ability to have a deep connection, at times critical connection to culture. I am continually, I continue to be motivated by arts-related projects for exactly that reason. I think architecture and art in concert together have the ability to produce truly extraordinary things, very lively things. Our office began with an arts project. In 1995, Inner City Arts was opened. We began the project in 1992, immediately following the 92 Rodney King uprisings in Los Angeles. It was a time when the city really completely changed in many people's eyes, from a city that had been had an idea that it was really a multicultural city, when in fact it was a city of many cultures, highly separated and siloized. And that moment was in many ways devastating for me as really a young architect and also fairly new to Los Angeles, because many of my assumptions about the city and what it was were changing almost instantaneously, almost overnight. I was put in touch with a emerging arts organization, Inner City Arts, by the opera director, Peter Sellers, who was working with them at the time. Inner City Arts is an art school. It's a private, nonprofit school in the heart of Skid Row, adjacent to downtown in Los Angeles. Its goal is to work with the Unified School District to provide arts education for kids in that area of the city who don't have that kind of access to arts education, and certainly haven't since Proposition 13, which was really a real estate change in laws that took a lot of the tax base for schools away and made it very difficult to fund arts education, especially in school districts that didn't have that kind of ability for families to privately fund, come together and fund the school. There are a number of different spaces that have grown up over time on that campus. It isn't only art studios, but also not so dissimilarly to the Moody Center, Arts and Resource Library. There's a quite large black box theater, as well as a range of arts classrooms. Inner City Arts isn't trying to necessarily train young artists. That's not really its primary goal. Its goal is to become a kind of, to be able to use the arts as a kind of bridge between those students' experiences and being able to either access, talk about, represent their current situation, but also what they hope their future might be. Some kids over the years have in fact now gone on to school and have moved into the arts, both fine arts and commercial arts. There have been a number of successes in that way, but really what Inner City Arts has become more than anything is an arts organization that has truly anchored this neighborhood and this community and has become a kind of center of community in a part of Los Angeles where that doesn't normally exist. The building gets used in a number of ways. I like this picture because it's the parking lot that we built on the second floor that's been transformed into an event space, which it is often, but is really an example of how the building takes on many different personalities and has a great flexibility to put on and to support cultural and cultural work in the city. Not long after we began, or we were working on Inner City Arts, we were hired by a new museum director in Los Angeles, Annie Philbin, who had come from the Drawing Center in New York. And her goal, and really her mandate, was to try to transform the Hammer, which you see here, one of the very last buildings that Ed Larrabee Barnes, the modernist architect, had designed and built. It's attached to the Occidental Petroleum Company, which is the building that Armand Hammer had founded and ran at that point. Soon after the building was built, Hammer passed away within a couple of weeks. And the building and the museum almost disappeared really from the consciousness in Los Angeles, at least the institutional consciousness around arts organizations. Annie had an idea about really transforming the Hammer. And part of it had to do with creating a more significant accessibility between the museum and the community around it. This was also at a moment when museums were undergoing phenomenal transformation. They were really moving from, I'd say, the model more or less on the left, the Met, a kind of storehouse of our culture's most important artifacts, but very reticent to create a more accessible and more immediate connection with a larger public. And a new project that Frank Gehry did at the time called the Temporary Contemporary, it's now become the Geffen Contemporary, where that sense of the grand, classical, foreboding staircase was completely removed. The museum was now in a big old repair garage, renovated for art. And the access was right off of the street through a series of roll-up garage doors. The building couldn't be any more immediate. Just that change at that time, I think, was also an indication of how architecture was playing a role in transforming that ability for institutions to create a sense of more immediacy, more access, maybe even a sense of the informal. Annie's mandate was to make the Hammer first and foremost, before anything else, a kind of living room for the artists in the city. Her goal was to make it really a home and a welcome home for the artists, knowing that if the artists felt like this was their place and they had the opportunity to really take over the space, inevitably people who are interested in the arts would likely follow. We've continued to renovate the museum. It's my longest running project. We started the project in, as I said, I think it was 1999. We're on phase 6 right now. I think it might be the last phase. I think I'm going to get buried in the courtyard at some point eventually. As we've continued to evolve those spaces, one of the things that we've continued to hold on to is to allow there to be and to really identify spaces within the museum that are unconventional and that artists can take over in less precious ways. It creates a kind of liveliness that, along with the more normally programmed gallery exhibitions, really does create a sense that an artist, no matter what their age, no matter where they are in their career, have the opportunity to find a place at the Hammer. We've really grown the programming. Again, this was also one of the changes in museums that you saw around this time, where it wasn't enough that a museum was a space of galleries, but it really needed to connect to its audience in broader ways. Museums started to have cafes, bookstores that were really growing, auditoriums and lecture spaces that could take on a wide range of different performance events. And these are just a few of the different types of space. Education, small education spaces, the Nimoy Theater Gallery on the upper right-hand corner, which is a very highly flexible space in the museum, a cafe, the Billy Wilder Theater, which is really one of the most capable performance projection spaces in the city, working with the Film and Television Archive at UCLA. It can show everything from the earliest nitrate film to the latest digital technologies. And of course, also significant gallery space that we've continued to grow in the museum. The Hammer Museum has a important permanent collection, and that permanent collection, in fact, has to always be on display. It's part of the mandate of the Hammer, and as well as the very lively contemporary programs that the Hammer is always involved in. We did the design of the permanent collection as well on the right-hand side. But one of the challenges in the Hammer, in the original Barnes building, was that the courtyard and the galleries, there were galleries on both sides of an open courtyard, but they were disconnected. You had to circulate all the way around to get from one to another. Maybe the most important thing that we've done at the Hammer is the smallest piece of the project, and that was to design and build the Tunney Bridge, the John Tunney Bridge, which connects the two sides of the courtyard. And the reason it's so important is that it physically unites the galleries in a much more immediate way. Curators can now curate the programs in the museum using really both sides, the permanent and the temporary exhibition spaces, more fluidly. It really broadens the ability to create stories in the museum. And I think it reinforces that idea that Annie began with when she first came to the Hammer, that the museum needed to be about connections. Connections between the artists and the museum, between the artists and their larger community, between art and contemporary culture. Around the same time, we were selected to do a project for the Museum of Modern Art. They were in the process of doing the very large Taniguchi expansion in downtown Manhattan, enlarging that museum significantly. And because of really the pragmatics and the logistics of that project and the challenges of building in the middle of downtown Manhattan, they started to realize that they would need to do programming. If they wanted programming to continue, they would need to have a remote facility. And they found a building in Long Island City, which was it was the old Swingline stapler factory. It's where they actually made the staples. And that eventually would become permanent storage, but in the meantime, they would do temporary exhibitions, which meant that almost everybody was coming to the building on the 7 train. And if you've ever been on the 7 train in this part of New York, it's elevated, so you have this feeling of surfing above all of the roofs, above the landscape as you approach the building. The other thing that was, in a way, unique about this project, even from it to think about it as an architect, is that in contrast to almost all museums, which are fundamentally about permanence. Museums are fundamentally about acquiring work and keeping that work in a very permanent way and conserving that work for successive generations. The MoMA Queens project was going to be about the temporary. It was, in a way, the exact opposite. And I was really, in the beginning, struggling with what it meant to make a temporary museum and how that could play into the larger identity of MoMA. And as I began to dig more deeply into the history of the Museum of Modern Art, one of the things that I came to discover was that Alfred Barr, the founding director of the museum, in the very beginning talked about the museum in a kind of I wouldn't say impermanent way, but in an extremely dynamic way, a non-static way, not in a traditionally permanent way. And he did these diagrams. He did a number of them. This is really one of the first ones, maybe my favorite, where he was thinking about the museum being a kind of torpedo or a missile speeding through culture. And he wrote this thing that the museum should be a torpedo speeding through time, its nose the ever-advancing present, its tail ever-receding past, last 50 to 100 years of culture and artistic making. And that idea that the museum itself maybe at least could be could refresh this idea of a sense of dynamism and movement and progress forward. For me, also related to the idea of the temporary, that you would never be in one place for very long, that you as well were going to be on this journey moving forward. Part of that was in the we had very simple means to make this building, because it also was temporary, which meant they weren't going to spend a lot of money on a temporary building. But we used everything at our disposal, including things like the shrouds around all of the mechanical equipment on the roof, and we painted the logo MoMA from one point. And as you moved along on the 7 train, those letters, which seemed quite abstract, came into focus just before you entered the station. And for a moment, you saw that logo, the MoMA identity, and then it disappeared. As you came down from the train, there are a series of these strip lights that we used. They're the same lights that are used in the subway, and they created a kind of breadcrumb trail leading you in a staccato fashion to the front door of the museum. And then even when you walked into the space, the lobby space, was not a big hall, a kind of classical hall that you entered, but it was more an unfolding narrative and more of a journey as you weaved up and down these ramps and eventually to the galleries themselves, which, of course, because it was MoMA, or is MoMA, held some of the most extraordinary work, certainly modern and contemporary work in the world. And there was this shock that most people had seeing that work after having taken the subway and walked by the bodega and down the street in a part of the city that they had never seen before through this more raw building, which we really did try to amplify by making the architecture very direct and very matter of fact, and then standing in front of Picasso or seeing Brancusi bird in space. One of my favorite shows was a second or third show, which was Max Beckmann Retrospective, and to see Max Beckmann somehow in the middle of Long Island City was really quite something. We've been working with Regan Projects, a gallery, a private gallery in Los Angeles for a number of years. Stuart and Sean Regan, probably two of my oldest friends. Stuart passed away a number of years ago. Sean has continued to evolve and move that gallery forward over the years. We've done a number of different spaces, but about 7 or 8 years ago, we built the largest of the galleries using a bit of an existing building and also adding quite a bit of new gallery to the building. It is it's been a catalytic project in this part of Los Angeles. It's in the Hollywood district. There were no galleries really here at all. There was some film production around, but it has been it's a very matter-of-fact, very quintessential Los Angeles street scene of taco shop, and there's a 7-Eleven, some big box storage, and then Regan Projects. And I think that position that art often occupies of having a kind of catalytic presence in cities, very often moving into parts of the city that have not yet been discovered or have been forgotten, and redrawing attention urbanistically to those areas is one of the places where art and architecture certainly have had a very strong relationship. And that comes with complexities as well. There are critical aspects of that in terms of urban development and gentrification, but it is also very much a role that art has played in an extremely beneficial way. The galleries that we designed at Regan Projects are Regan's largest galleries. There is one very large gallery that is the primary gallery. It gets changed quite often. It is extremely flexible space. It's been able to show a wide range of different installations, from more classical works on paper and painting on wall to installations and more sculptural installations within the space. The artists have, over the years, really taken the space on, and in some cases jackhammered in and drilled in and really messed with the space. It's also a space that is a place where an exploration around light and the way architecture can modify and control light. It was a building where we were really experimenting with that. It came from very pragmatic or practical reasons. We were going to occupy the roof, which meant it was very difficult to bring skylights down through the building. We only had one place to bring skylights, and that was right in the center. We created this kind of light chimney that then, in a periscope-like fashion, reflected the light out and dropped it down through those two linear skylights. And that picture in the top left, it's a little disorienting, but that's a picture in that light chimney, which was completely clad with mylar film and reflective surfaces. My goal here was to not just depend on artificial light. I love natural light in galleries because it has a kind of quality to it, a tangible quality to the color, almost the atmospherics of it, and what I often refer to as the thickness of the light that you get with natural light that animates the work inside of it. There are many different spaces and many different vantage points that the building allows to the art and also back out to the city, including some low windows that look out onto the sidewalks and out onto the city. It makes, at times, parts of the gallery feel like it's levitating. The roof on the right-hand corner, that roof has had a number of sculptures, but one of the longest tenured sculptures is a piece I love by Dan Graham, which seems appropriate to show this week, and is a very beautiful piece that really reflects the city around it. Allison mentioned that we're involved in a number of exhibition designs. It's a type of work that I also love. I'm not going to go into it so much, but one of the things that's so different about exhibition design from architecture is how quickly it happens, and yet there is still very deep ideas in it, and that's something that I think is really profound to bring through architecture into its relationship to art. I just wanted to touch on two other projects. One, a project we finished just recently, just before the pandemic. I have not seen this building finished because I have not been able to get to Canada until, well, actually in a couple weeks I'm going. For the Inuit Art Center, it's the largest collection of contemporary Inuit art in Canada. It's attached to a 1970s building by Gusta Rosa, very modernist, geometric building you can see on the right. Each of the buildings were meant to maintain their own identity and yet really work in partnership. One of the things that I kept talking about, I'm not sure anybody understood what I meant, but I kept talking about the new building being an object that would complete another object, that the two of them would have their own ability to have an identity, but the two of them together would create a more complete whole. Accessibility, it was hugely important here. The primary collection is held in a glass vault in the middle of the lobby. Most of the collection are small stone sculptures, so they don't have quite the same conservation requirements as, for instance, works on paper, so they can be more exposed. But it also means that as you drive around the city and just come around this corner, you're seeing activity, really the primary activity, and you're seeing the collection right off of the street. That vault goes down into the basement, feels like it's coming up from that. You see curators and conservators working in the vault. It has this very fluid shape, this kind of crystalline, a little bit magic quality, and also allows you to get very close to the collection in a way that you might not, well, you wouldn't if it was in the deep basement of storage where it had been located before. There's a series of spaces, auditorium space. In this case, it can be closed off, but also can be opened up to the street. You can see lectures going on. This is a photograph I took when we went to the north to visit many of the artists in that part of the Arctic Circle. I have had an interest for a very long time in the studio spaces where art is made, where artists make space, because I often think, and this is probably an argument in art and curatorial practice, but I often think that art looks the best in spaces that somehow refer to or approximate the spaces where the art was made. And that's sometimes very true of 17th, 18th century painting and artwork. It's certainly, I think, true of abstract expressionist work and when it's seen in a kind of loft-like environment. The thing about the Inuit art is that the studio was this. Most of the work is made outside across the year, and as a nomadic culture, it was almost always made outside. And the work is very, very small. And it was incredible to me how the sculpture could be held in a space that vast. And so when we were designing the gallery, one of the things I was trying, the primary gallery, was trying to explore was, could you create a space that started to feel like it had that kind of scale of the North, had the light of the North, had the kind of fluidity of the North, that didn't diminish or maybe anthropomorphize. Most of the work is seen with a little point spot on it. It looks like it's an anthropology museum. And I thought it needed to have that kind of scale of space to really be seen most appropriately. Finally, I feel like we should just get up and walk around and I could explain to you what's the building. But I wanted to talk a little bit for a few minutes about the Moody Center. The program for the Moody Center when we were first hired was really an invention and was not set. It was a program that was evolving because the idea of an interdisciplinary arts center was a very new one. And what was going to go into that, what the different constituent parts would be to try to help make the center a success, were really a big part of the conversation, the debate. And we worked through many, many different evolutions to try to get at what the building might look like, might feel like, and how it might support this new idea. But one of the things that I started to do was to almost go back to the campus. It seemed like whenever we would talk amongst the larger group about what the Moody was, it really is a campus. It's a series of focus spaces that then have connections between them to form a much larger dynamic and a much larger conversation like the one that happens on a campus like Rice. So I had this fantasy that we would take all the buildings at Rice and smush them together into one building, and in some ways the building has a little bit of that quality with the long bars or the long rectangular forms. These are some original sketches. I was also interested in the campus and how the trees form this very dense canopy up on the second level, almost an opacity across the campus. But when you're on the ground, it's very wide open. And the building is very much like that. It's very solid up on top and then extremely transparent and more open on the ground level. There are these important vertical connections all through the building so that as you're moving through that campus-like interior, there are moments when you get these peaks and glimpses and quite literal connections to things happening either above or below you. The program is extremely varied, from the latest digital work to drill presses and analog making, and that combination is also quite extraordinary. That tells you something about making being so important here, and that's why even the machine shop is right out on the front facade. It is facing the campus and has a prominent presence on the campus. Of course, the gallery space, there are a number of different types of spaces that become gallery spaces within the building, but the primary gallery space is a very refined and highest level gallery space, but also took on this question of how to work with the light. And the monitor, the clear story up in the upper right-hand corner, is where the light comes in. There was very careful work to try to tune that so that the light would then fall into the gallery in a more diffused and even way. And the final image I want to end with is just that while we planned on many things, and we planned in the building, and we planned on trying to create a broad flexibility and a broad range of different programs that could take place in the building. Maybe the thing that I'm the most excited about is the way that the building has continued to be used as an armature, not just in the building, but on the outside as well. That dream of artists, curators, makers, taking over the space and maybe even really pushing up against the building in some quite heavy ways, and not treating the building in too precious a way, tells me that the building is being successful in trying to create an ongoing and very positive connection with artistic practice now and hopefully continuing into the future. So, thank you. Under 3.5 hours. I don't know if I left that much time for that.
Thank you, Michael, for that wonderful talk and for a very close reading of the relationship between art and architecture. I think you're raising many wonderful points about the role of the arts in society, how architecture links to that. But I have a couple of questions that come to mind relative to that. I think one is more contextual, but the other one is maybe more about the design process. And you speak a lot about the link between art and architecture and how they both have a certain link to the past and also to the future, how they project into the future and reflect. You also, in some of your other writings and interviews, you talk about the role of writing in your design process and how writing helps you synthesize your ideas in a very particular way that design process doesn't allow. So my question is really about the role of art in your design process. How do you engage art or the arts, and which particular forms of arts help inform your design decision, be it drawing or video or other forms of making?
Coming out of art school, maybe one of the most important influences was just the culture of making amongst my friends. We would all visit each other in our studios, often very late at night, and you would see people making things in ways and have conversations about what they were making, which for me gave me an image of how a studio culture was different than maybe a more traditional office culture. And first and foremost, I think I've tried to make an office or a studio that, for me, replicates somehow the artist studio. That's kind of the goal, both physically in the space, but also just the feeling that when you walk in, hopefully people have the sense that something can be made there. But I've had a long connection to the arts in terms of the way in which the work of artists have had a real role in the way that I've approached intellectually the work. I look at work, I have looked at work for a very long time. I can't say that there's one type of work or there's necessarily one group of artists that are most important to me. It's more the way that I find ideas in that work. My undergraduate thesis was really completely built around Richard Serra's early sculpture, and actually a piece of writing that Yves Lambois did, talking about his sculpture Sarah's sculpture in the Tuileries, Clara Clara, because it was a way of starting to think about movement and motion and the connection between the audience for a building and the building itself, which I had felt was too disconnected, had become too abstracted, too formal. So for me, it's important as a way to almost approach architecture from outside architecture and to look at architecture more freshly.
Interesting. I think it also links to the mission of the Moody and the kind of the programming here, which is to bring the making closer to the display of the art and to create more of a dialogue. Relative to that, I'm also curious a little bit about the lessons from Winnipeg in particular. There is a lot of conversations right now in the curatorial world, in the art world, art history world, about decolonizing the museums and how that's done through different curatorial strategies. And I wonder, what were your lessons from that particular project in terms of what we can do as architects to operate in a truly multicultural context? And with that, I just want to say it was really wonderful how you made a distinction in your earlier in the presentation between the multicultural and the places of many cultures, like how there's two different things actually potentially coexisting out there. So what would you say was your lesson from that particular project?
At the IAC, Inuit Art Center, now its official name is Kalmayuk, which is the Inuit name for the building. The most important thing was really the ongoing conversations with the culture itself, the members of the culture, the artists, but the elders that represented the culture more broadly. That Inuit culture is also quite diverse. There are a series of villages. It's an enormous land that they had once occupied. The art centers are fairly far apart. They have distinct identities. They have distinct approaches to art. They have distinct medium now as they've continued to evolve their art. I think it's the role in that case of the architect to first and foremost be able to have a very deep listening to what is being said and to understand not only what is being said literally, but to try to get a sense of what is being said in a more, maybe even in the body language of those conversations. The visits to the north were very important, but the Inuit representatives would often come to Winnipeg for those meetings. There's a very strong connection, and there has been for a long time, between Winnipeg and especially the cultures around Hudson's Bay. And the building would evolve and change over the course of that process through those conversations. In that sense, they were really the clients of the building, in the same way that an architect often works with a client, that you're evolving something together. And that back and forth continues to change things in important ways. And in the end, you hope that it does represent those conversations. And I think, my sense is, given the feedback that it has.
Mm-hmm. It's also interesting because I do think it also speaks a little bit to the nuance between how this particular topic is approached in Canada versus the US, and how the indigenous cultures are pulled into the larger museum culture. I know we would like to also get to the point to give audience a chance to ask a question, but
absolutely.
I think that
I'm going to ask
Alison,
one question.
I have a first.
Audience, but I think on the occasion of this anniversary, as a moment of both looking back and looking forward, I really appreciate your taking us through this history, because I do think the way that art and architecture has interacted has changed pretty dramatically since, if you go back to MoMA Queens, and even a large institution like MoMA or a university art museum like the Hammer, you've really presented a pretty extraordinary transformation throughout your practice. And so my question is really, what do you think needs to happen going forward? How should spaces continue to evolve to support these transitions as we continue to innovate and incorporate issues like multiculturalism and others?
It's a really complicated question, I think, because it is still very much evolving. And it's a question of, can you forecast a kind of space to meet up with where art practice might be in the future? I would say that there is no real singular answer, but I do believe that, well, one, accessibility, transparency, and a kind of immediacy to the way that a building and a program and institution can engage with its communities, and I mean communities in a very broad way, is only going to become more and more necessary. And how that happens in quite literal ways to allow the building to move open, to open up to the outside, to be more transparent, to create stronger possibilities for informal programming, for the building to really be co-opted by less formal groups, I think is hugely important. But flexibility in and of itself doesn't solve the problem. Flexibility has been something that has been a modernist dream, arguably since the early part of the 20th century. And many, many people have tried it, and it's worked at times in different ways, but just as often, the way cultures, societies continue to move, it's outstripped the projection of that flexibility before it even happened. I think there's something to be said about not so much flexibility, but diversity, and creating a range of different types of spaces, sometimes quite specific to deal with.
You're back.
Quite specific to deal with. That's still working, but maybe you can hear me. I'm just going to talk. Okay, maybe I should. I don't know. Do I need to?
There you go.
I got this. Sometimes quite specific to deal with the technical challenges that inevitably are necessary, and then often spaces that are in a way unprogrammed, undefined, and very open. And I will say that type of space is one of the most difficult spaces to try to hang on to try to develop in an institutional setting, because inevitably, in institutional settings, spaces have to be about something. You know, they have to work on the Excel spreadsheet, but the future doesn't really fit into the Excel spreadsheet in exactly that way. So I think that's part of it. You have to be. I think institutions, groups have to be courageous enough to develop spaces that don't yet have a purpose, all the while also having spaces that have very specific purposes. And somehow in that soup, I think you have the possibility of creating the greatest range of possibility for the future.
So we'd be glad to take a couple of questions from the audience. Yes.
Well, in the Rice community, starting from the arts, going to engineering, and out to the marching band and back, creativity is not just encouraged, it's demanded. Were there aspects of this project that really put a heavy demand on your creativity? And were there areas where you sat back and said, yeah, nailed that?
I think because the Moody Center was, as I mentioned in the beginning, a kind of invention. It wasn't something that Rice yet knew how to do. It wasn't a science building. It wasn't an engineering building. It wasn't a gymnasium. It didn't have a program that was maybe more traditional. Maybe you're going to change it a bit to keep up with a contemporary set of circumstances. But you know more or less what those buildings are going to be. The Moody Center was really starting with a completely clean slate. And I think that was the biggest challenge, was to try to, in a way, almost through the process, stay just a bit ahead of the conversation with what we were proposing, so that people could react to it, but not get so far out ahead that it just it didn't relate to the way the conversation was evolving, developing the overall program for the Moody Center. In terms of whether I nailed it or not, I'll leave that up to everybody else as you walk around.
Well, we've gone a little bit over time, so if there are no more questions, I'd just like to conclude by thanking Michael Maltzan both for coming tonight and for this fantastic building.
Thank you.